September 9th, 1860. Castle Creek, Idaho Territory. 44 people in 12 wagons face a decision that will determine whether they live or die. Approximately 100 Shoshone and Bannock warriors have surrounded their position. The wagon master gives the order. The teams wheel inward, tongues and ox chains linking each wagon to the next, forming a circle 100 yards across. Inside this makeshift fort, families huddle with their children. Outside, warriors prepare for an assault that will last 2 days. This is the image burned into American consciousness. The defensive wagon circle. Hollywood has shown it to us 1,000 times. Pioneers frantically forming their mobile fortress as painted warriors thunder across the prairie. Women and children loading rifles, passing ammunition to their husbands and fathers who fire from between the wagons. The thin line of civilization holding off the savage wilderness. It's an icon of the American West, as familiar as the cowboy's 10-gallon hat or the shootout at high noon. There's just one problem. Almost none of it is true. The real story of wagon trains and the overland trails is not a tale of constant warfare. It's something far more mundane and far more deadly. Between 1840 and 1860, approximately 362 emigrants died from Native American attacks. During that same period, cholera alone killed tens of thousands. Disease killed emigrants at rates 50 to 100 times higher than Indian violence. The defensive wagon circle, that iconic symbol of frontier courage, served primarily as a livestock corral. And the image itself didn't come from actual trail experience. It came from a theatrical staging requirement in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, performed decades after the wagon train era had ended. This is the story of how America got the West wrong, how entertainment became history, and how the real dangers faced by westward emigrants, disease, accidents, environmental hazards, were buried beneath a mythology of constant combat that never existed. The Great Migration westward began in earnest in 1841 and continued through 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad ended the wagon train era. During those 28 years, somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 people crossed 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain to reach Oregon, California, and other western destinations. They traveled in covered wagons, prairie schooners weighing 1,300 pounds empty, pulled by teams of 4 to 8 oxen. They carried everything they owned, and they knew that many of them would die along the way. But how many, and from what causes, tells us the real story of westward expansion. The Oregon Trail alone became known as the nation's longest graveyard, with an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 total deaths over its length. That's 10 to 15 graves per mile, a mortality rate of 4 to 10% of all the travelers. For a journey that typically took 4 to 6 months and covered 15 to 20 miles per day, death was not a distant possibility but a constant companion. What killed these people? The answer demolishes our popular imagery. Disease accounted for approximately 90% of all trail deaths. Cholera led the list, a waterborne bacterial infection that killed victims within 12 to 24 hours of first symptoms. One emigrant wrote on June 8, 1852, that the great cause of diarrhea and death had been occasioned in most instances by drinking water from holes dug in the riverbank and long marshes. The peak migration years of 1849 through 1853 saw cholera strike with particular ferocity. Entire families would be healthy at breakfast and dead by nightfall. Emigrants passed grave after grave, some so fresh the dirt still looked disturbed, others marked only by a weathered board or a pile of stones. Beyond cholera came dysentery, typhoid fever, measles, especially fatal to children, mountain fever, smallpox, pneumonia, and scurvy. These were the real killers on the trail. Not arrows, but bacteria. Not violence, but invisible organisms that turned a person's own body against them. The second leading cause of death involved wagon accidents. Children and adults slipped while getting in or out of moving wagons and were crushed by wheels. prairie schooners carried 700 pounds or more of cargo. A wagon wheel rolling over a human torso produced injuries that frontier medicine could not treat. Runaway wagons on downhill grades, vehicles overturning on steep terrain, people falling from moving wagons. These mishaps killed with grim regularity. The third major cause of traumatic death came from accidental gunshot wounds. Prior to the Civil War, a surprising number of emigrants had little, if any, sophistication in their use of weapons. The result, though tragic, is not surprising. Overlanders shot each other and themselves with astonishing regularity. The most common accident involved pulling loaded rifles muzzle first from wagons. One person would grab the barrel, the trigger would catch on something inside the wagon, and the rifle would discharge into the person's face or chest. One researcher concluded that gun accidents killed probably 100 times more pioneers than Indian attacks. More wagon train pioneers were killed and wounded by themselves and each other than by the warrior tribes through whose land they were passing. Drownings at river crossings, weather-related deaths from exposure or lightning strikes, livestock-related injuries, snake bites, all of these exceeded violence as mortality factors. One comprehensive calculation determined that only 4% of pioneer deaths resulted from Native American attacks. 4%. That means 96% died from other causes. Yet if you ask most Americans what killed pioneers on the wagon trains, they'll tell you Indians. The mythology is that powerful. The reality is that American Indians were usually among the least of the emigrants' problems. They were mostly peaceful and helped the emigrants in a variety of ways. Tales of hostile encounters far overshadowed actual incidents. Let's examine what wagon trains actually looked like, because even this basic fact contradicts popular imagery. Hollywood loves to show massive wagon trains stretching over 100 wagons long, snaking across the landscape in a vulnerable, single-file line. This image represents a brief historical anomaly rather than typical experience. The so-called Great Migration of 1843 included 120 wagons carrying approximately 1,000 emigrants and more than 5,000 animals. But this train proved so unwieldy that it quickly split into smaller units after encountering narrow mountain paths. The organizer himself noted that it was soon found that no progress could be made with a body so cumbrous. Following this experiment, emigrants learned harsh lessons about optimal organization. By the mid-1840s, the standard wagon train consisted of 12 to 30 wagons. This size balanced security through numbers with practical resource management. Too many people and animals at the same time could deplete water and forage sources. A small caravan of around 12 to 24 wagons made better sense. Larger groups took longer to organize each morning, struggled to find adequate pasture for their animals, and exhausted water sources at critical stops along the trail. The peak year of 1849, when gold fever sent thousands rushing to California, saw 5,516 wagons pass through Fort Kearny on June 23rd alone. But these traveled in small, independent groups rather than massive organized caravans. The Mormon Trail organized approximately 170 wagons divided among 6 separate trains for the 1864 season. The Santa Fe Trail saw commercial caravans grow from 3 wagons in 1822 to 414 wagons in 1846. But these traveled in multiple separate groups rather than one massive train. The California Trail, which carried approximately 250,000 emigrants between 1841 and 1869, more than any other route, typically featured trains of 30 or fewer wagons. Travel formations varied by terrain and circumstances. When wagons moved in single file through narrow passes, a 60-wagon train would stretch 3/4 of a mile, with approximately 66 feet between wagons. But whenever terrain permitted, trains often fanned out and traveled abreast to minimize the amount of dust blown onto other wagons. This created parallel columns rather than single file. This formation served practical rather than tactical purposes. It had nothing to do with defense. Which brings us to the nightly wagon circle. If you've watched any Western, you know the routine. As sunset approaches, the wagon master surveys the terrain and selects the night's camping spot. The lead wagons begin to turn inward, each following the one before, until they've formed a complete circle with wagons touching tongue to tailgate. Once the circle is complete, the men grab their rifles and take up defensive positions while women and children huddle inside the protective ring. Everyone beds down inside the circle, protected by their mobile fortress, while guards keep watch through the night for Indian attacks. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. The most detailed contemporary description of wagon circle formation comes from an 1843 account published decades later. The description is precise and revealing. The pilot stands ready to conduct the train in the circle which he has previously measured and marked out, which is to form the invariable fortification for the night. The leading wagons follow him so nearly around the circle that but a wagon length separates them. The circle is 100 yards deep, formed with wagons connected strongly with each other, the wagon in the rear being connected with the wagon in front by its tongue and ox chains. It is a strong barrier that the most vicious ox cannot break. Notice what this account emphasizes: not repelling attackers, but containing oxen. The entire formation took approximately 10 minutes from halt to completion, with teams immediately unyoked and driven out to pasture beyond the circle. The animals didn't stay inside the circle. They grazed outside it, with guards protecting them from the real nocturnal threat: horse theft. Another account from 1836 makes this even more explicit. A fur trade caravan encamped in a large ring with baggage and men, tents and wagons on the outside, and all the animals except the cows, which were fastened to pickets within the circle. This arrangement accommodated the guard, who stood watch every night and day, also when they were in motion, to protect the animals from the approach of Indians who would steal them. Humans camped outside the wagon circle. Horses stayed inside. The defensive priority was preventing theft, not fighting off attacks. The logistical mathematics make defensive circles impractical for combat anyway. A 22-wagon train with 6 to 8 draft animals per wagon would have 132 to 176 oxen, plus additional saddle horses. Approximately 200 animals requiring roughly 16,000 square feet at a bare minimum. A wagon circle with 23-foot wagons creates a circumference of about 500 feet and an area of 20,000 square feet. Add 22 tents, campfires, cooking areas, and space for people, and there's insufficient room. Grass inside the circle would be trampled down and covered with several inches of manure in a matter of hours. Mountain terrain frequently made circles impossible. Emigrants camped strung out along a creek or a relatively flat ridge of land. The protection of a wagon circle often became a luxury when geography dictated otherwise. The nightly circle was a livestock management technique, not a military tactic. So where did the defensive wagon circle myth come from? The answer lies not in wagon train history, but in show business. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show ran from 1883 to 1913, after the actual trail era had ended in 1869. The show required creative staging for oval performance spaces. Circling the wagons and directing the Indians on horseback to ride around the perimeter turned out to be the most economical use of the space. That's showbiz. The fact that this particular element of the show was totally fictitious apparently bothered no one. This theatrical invention entered countless Hollywood westerns, creating an enduring mythology detached from documented reality. Documented instances of wagons circled for actual defense are extraordinarily rare. In fact, their rarity is what makes them notable. The utter Van Ornum massacre of September 9th and 10th, 1860 stands out precisely because it was a rare occasion when Indians not only attempted, but sustained a prolonged assault on encircled emigrant wagons. This incident involved 44 people in 12 wagons attacked near Castle Creek, Idaho. The wagon train formed a defensive circle to protect the livestock and offered food and other items to avoid conflict, but sustained attacks over 2 days ultimately killed 28 people. Survivors eventually abandoned the wagons and fled on foot, with only 16 people surviving the ordeal. The specific designation of this incident as rare confirms that defensive circling during sustained attacks was highly uncommon. This brings us to the question of what actually happened between immigrants and Native Americans. Because the statistical reality contradicts everything we think we know. The most comprehensive research on this topic analyzed thousands of primary sources over more than a decade. The result documented 362 immigrants killed by Native Americans between 1840 and 1860. During the same period, immigrants killed 425 Native Americans. More Indians killed by whites than whites killed by Indians. These 362 deaths occurred among approximately 350,000 to 420,000 immigrants who traveled westward during this period. That's an attack death rate of less than 0.1% of all travelers. Geographic concentration was striking. 90% of Indian-caused deaths occurred west of South Pass in the Rocky Mountains, primarily along the Snake and Humboldt rivers in present-day Idaho and Nevada. The nature of Indian-white contact is less a tale of violence and theft on the plains and more a case of cooperation and assistance by the tribes and abuse by whites, especially in the 1840s. This finding, supported by systematic analysis of emigrant diaries, letters, and contemporary accounts, inverts the popular narrative of hostile Indians attacking innocent pioneers. Relations were further complicated by trigger-happy emigrants who shot at Indians for target practice and out of unfounded fear. One emigrant wrote during her 1852 journey that we are continually hearing of the depredations of the Indians, but we have not seen one yet. This represented the typical experience. Fear greatly exceeded actual danger. Native Americans operated river ferries, charging approximately 25 cents per wagon. They provided fresh food through trade. They served as guides and pointed out edible routes. Most emigrant-native interactions were peaceful trading partnerships. One Shoshone chief boasted he had never killed a white person. Multiple emigrant journals documented countless exchanges of kindness and hospitality that didn't make sensational newspaper headlines. The early years featured particularly cooperative interactions. The Fort Laramie Treaty of September 17, 1851 formalized peaceful relations. Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and other tribes agreed to allow safe passage for immigrants in exchange for $50,000 in annual payments for 50 years and U.S. protection of Indian lands from encroachment. However, the U.S. Senate unilaterally reduced payment duration from 50 to 10 years without proper tribal consent. Only one annuity payment reached some tribes. The government's systematic failure to prevent mass settler encroachment onto treaty-protected lands intensified native hostility through the 1850s and 1860s. By 1853, 8,000 wagon trains per year were overgrazing lands, burning sagebrush and trees for fuel, decimating buffalo herds that constituted primary food sources, spreading diseases to native populations, and desecrating sacred grounds and burial sites. When violence occurred, it frequently represented retaliation for previous emigrant aggression against different tribal groups, a cycle of revenge across ethnic lines rather than individual accountability. The most extensively documented incidents provide context for the limited violence that did occur. The Whitman massacre of November 29, 1847 killed 13 to 14 people at a mission near present-day Walla Walla, Washington. A measles epidemic had killed approximately half the Cayuse population, with nearly all children dying. Rumors spread that the missionary doctor was poisoning Indians rather than treating them. Cayuse traditional belief held that medicine men with excessive spiritual power could have murderous intentions and that failed healers could justly be killed. The tribe believed the missionary violated his agreement He came to teach Christianity, but instead brought settlers and disease. The Ward Massacre of August 20th, 1854, near the Boise River, killed 18 to 19 of 20 emigrants. The initial party stopped for lunch and watering stock when approximately 200 Shoshone and Snake warriors attacked. The trigger was horse theft. An emigrant shot a thief, initiating full assault. Women and children were tortured to death. Only 2 boys survived, both shot with multiple arrows and left for dead. One crawled for days with an arrow through his lung, eventually reaching a fort. The military retaliation so enraged local tribes that both regional forts were temporarily abandoned, making the Oregon Trail unsafe without military escort. The Kelly-Larimer wagon train attack of July 1864 began when 80 to 100 Indians initially appeared friendly and asked for food. One of the emigrants later published her memoir describing how she entreated her husband to forbear and only attempt conciliation. "If you fire 1 shot," she said, "I feel sure you will seal our fate, as they seem to outnumber us 10 to 1. Despite her warnings, conflict erupted, killing 5 to 6 people initially. 2 women were taken captive along with children, providing rare first-person accounts of captivity experiences. These incidents, and a handful of others, represent the documented reality of wagon train violence. They were rare, usually triggered by specific incidents rather than random savagery, and often involved complex circumstances, including treaty violations, disease epidemics, horse theft, and cycles of retaliatory violence. The academic consensus reveals that American Indians were usually among the least of the emigrants' problems. This brings us to another Hollywood staple: women and children as ammunition handlers during defensive battles. The image is cinematic gold. While men fire rifles from between the wagons, women frantically reload weapons and pass them forward, maintaining constant fire. Children scurry about carrying powder horns and ammunition. Every able-bodied person has a role, transforming the defensive circle into an efficient fighting machine. Extensive research of emigrant diaries, contemporary accounts, and military reports reveals no credible evidence of women or children serving as ammunition handlers during defensive actions. Instead, a strict gender-based division of labor characterized the rare defensive situations that occurred. The most detailed account describes a 150 wagon train with 375 men, 36 women, and 56 children facing assault. Contemporary accounts state explicitly that the women and children helped to dig a trench around the corral and carried buckets of water from the river, while the men kept the Indians at bay with a volley of rifle shots. This clear division, men handling all firearms operations while women and children performed support tasks, appears consistently across documented incidents. One published memoir describes women's actual role during an attack. The woman attempted to prevent violence through persuasion rather than combat participation. An aftermath account notes that women in many instances drove the teams to prevent their husbands or fathers being taken at a disadvantage. Weapons were in every man's hands. Women drove wagons specifically so men could hold weapons, further evidence of strict gender segregation in armed defense. Another incident demonstrates women's crisis role differently. A Lakota Sioux woman, 8 months pregnant, recognized attackers as her own people and strode out into the midst of the battle to stop fighting. She threatened that her brother, a war chief, would take vengeance if they harmed her party. She successfully halted violence through negotiation rather than combat. Period firearms proficiency reveals why women didn't handle weapons. Prior to the Civil War, a surprising number of emigrants obviously had little if any sophistication in their use of weapons. Overlanders shot each other and themselves with astonishing regularity. Examples abound. One account notes a rifle burst, but did no damage except slightly bruising one man. Another recorded that one man accidentally shot himself through the head. He died instantly. More wagon train pioneers were killed and wounded by themselves and each other than by the warrior tribes. Most emigrants were middle-class families from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, not experienced frontiersmen. There were firearms of all descriptions, double and single-barreled shotguns and smoothbore and double-twisted rifles. The favorite gun was the old Kentucky rifle with a barrel 3 feet long. One account from 1864 noted that there were more than 100 wagons in the train and twice that many men, all armed, mostly with single-shot muzzle-loading rifles. Some, however, had repeating rifles and revolvers. The official 1859 U.S. Army Guidebook for Westward Travel recommended firearms and provided selection advice, but directed instructions exclusively at men with no mention of training women or children in weapons use. Emigrants carried irrational amounts of arms despite statistical safety. One 1846 example documented 72 wagons carrying 260 rifles and pistols, 1 ton of lead, and half a ton of gunpowder. Academic studies of women's expanded trail roles confirm non-combat contributions. Women remained responsible for food and laundry, but also gathered buffalo chips for fuel, drove teams of oxen, made bullets, and cared for the sick and injured. The critical distinction, making bullets, refers to casting lead bullets beforehand using bullet molds, standard preparatory work, not loading firearms during combat. Landmark research analyzed gender roles extensively using emigrant diaries, memoirs, and folk songs. Despite comprehensive research, this work does not document women as ammunition handlers during defensive actions. Women's increased trail responsibilities remained within gendered boundaries: domestic work, childcare, fuel gathering, driving teams, but not armed combat. During the rare attacks that occurred, documented division of labor shows men conducting all firearms, operations, shooting, reloading, strategic positioning, while women and children dug defensive trenches, carried water from rivers, cared for wounded, managed children, and drove wagons. The Hollywood image of women as ammunition handlers appears to be pure cinematic invention. The folk song Sweet Betsy from Pike includes verses about Betsy fighting Indians with musket and boar, but this represents folklore and satire, not documented history. No corroborating primary sources support such accounts. The scholarly revolution in understanding overland trail history produced revisionist results. Myths tumbled like ten-inch pins in systematic retelling of the trail narrative based on more than a decade analyzing thousands of primary sources. The statistical reality contrasts starkly with popular imagery. Total emigrants numbered 350,000 to 500,000 between 1840 and 1869, with mortality rates producing 20,000 to 30,000 total deaths. Disease accounted for 90%. Wagon accidents and accidental gunshot wounds followed, and Indian attacks caused only 362 documented deaths between 1840 and 1860, representing approximately 4% of trail deaths, while emigrants killed 425 Native Americans. The nature of Indian-white contact is less a tale of violence and theft on the plains, and more a case of cooperation and assistance by the tribes and abuse by whites, especially in the 1840s. This finding, supported by systematic primary source analysis, inverts the popular narrative of hostile Indians attacking innocent pioneers. Official scholarship reinforces these conclusions. American Indians were usually among the least of the emigrants' problems. They were mostly peaceful and helped the emigrants in a variety of ways. Tales of hostile encounters far overshadowed actual incidents. Relations were further complicated by trigger-happy emigrants who shot at Indians for target practice and out of unfounded fear. Daily trail reality contrasted sharply with adventure narratives. The journey was exciting, but when you're actually on the trail, you're waiting at river crossings, dealing with bug bites, and often moving very, very slowly. Emigrants traveled 15 to 20 miles per day over 4 to 6 months, complaining of snail-like travel and monotony punctuated by crises. Research revealed that fewer than 1 in 4 women who kept journals on the trail agreed with the decision to migrate. They joined reluctantly, leaving behind support networks while men pursued Western ambitions. Women's trail work expanded but remained gender-segregated. Cooking, childcare, bread baking, butter churning, collecting buffalo chips for fuel, driving oxen teams, making bullets beforehand, and caring for sick and injured. The historiographical revolution replaced sensationalized traditional narratives with systematic analysis of primary sources. Pre-1970s scholarship emphasized danger, heroism, and conflict with Native Americans, drawing heavily from dime novels and sensational accounts. Landmark work in 1979 marked the field's turning point, establishing that disease rather than violence was the primary killer, that Native American interactions were predominantly peaceful, and that environmental and logistical challenges exceeded human conflict. Academic consensus on wagon train defense is unambiguous. Sustained attacks were statistically rare. Defensive wagon circles served logistical rather than military purposes. Cooperation with native peoples was normal. Disease plus accidents, not violence, threatened emigrants. The documented historical record establishes that wagon train defense was rarely necessary. The journey's true dangers were biological and environmental rather than human conflict. Hollywood created an enduring mythology thoroughly refuted by systematic scholarly research. The academic revolution represents a complete inversion of popular imagery, replacing dramatic combat narratives with prosaic realities of cholera epidemics, wagon accidents, river crossings, and predominantly peaceful cross-cultural interactions. Castle Creek, Idaho Territory. September 11th, 1860, two boys stagger away from the Utter Van Ornum massacre site. Behind them lie the bodies of 28 emigrants. Ahead lies 45 days of desperate flight, starvation, and cannibalism before rescue. This incident, specifically designated as rare in historical scholarship, stands out precisely because sustained attacks on wagon trains almost never happened. The defensive circle that failed these emigrants was not a standard frontier tactic, but an improvisation in extremis, and even then it proved ineffective against determined assault. The real Oregon Trail contained 20,000 to 30,000 graves over 2,000 miles, 10 to 15 graves per mile, a 4% mortality rate, but only 4% of those deaths came from Indian attacks. The other 96% died from cholera, dysentery, typhoid, measles, wagon accidents, accidental gunshots, drownings, exposure, and 1,000 mundane disasters that don't make good cinema. The wagons didn't typically travel in massive trains of over 100 vehicles. They moved in groups of 12 to 30, small enough to find water and pasture, large enough to help each other across rivers and up mountain passes. They didn't circle defensively each night, while women loaded rifles and men fired from between the wagons. They circled to keep livestock from wandering, with humans camping outside the circle and animals inside. Most nights passed without incident. Most days involved monotonous walking, dust, heat, cold, boredom, and the grinding reality of 15 miles per day for 4 to 6 months. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show created the defensive wagon circle as theatrical staging. Hollywood turned it into history. And for more than a century, Americans have believed that westward expansion was primarily a story of combat between pioneers and Indians, when the truth is far more complex and far less violent. The emigrants' real enemies were invisible. Bacteria in contaminated water, viral infections spreading through crowded camps, the limitations of 19th century medicine. Their real challenges were environmental. Rivers to cross, mountains to climb, deserts to traverse, livestock to manage, supplies to ration. Their interactions with Native Americans were predominantly peaceful, characterized by trade, assistance, and cooperation far more than conflict. The mythology persists because it serves cultural purposes. The defensive wagon circle represents American self-reliance, courage under pressure, civilization holding off savagery. It's dramatically compelling. It reinforces narratives about who we are and how we got here, but it's not what happened. The archive tells a different story. Thousands of emigrant diaries and letters describe journey details with painful specificity. They complain about the dust, the heat, the cold, the endless walking. They mourn children dead from cholera, husbands crushed by wagon wheels, mothers dead in childbirth. They describe trading with Indians for fish and fresh vegetables. They note the tedium of waiting days for a river to become fordable. They record the terror of watching the person who seemed healthy this morning now dying of cholera this afternoon. 362 emigrants killed by Indians in 20 years. Hundreds of times that number killed by disease, more killed by their own firearms than by Indian arrows. These numbers don't make good Westerns. They don't create iconic images that burn themselves into cultural memory. But there what happened. The West was won not by heroic defensive circles, but by stubbornness in the face of disease, determination to keep walking even when every muscle aches, the ability to rebuild after losing everything to a river crossing gone wrong. It was won by people who buried their children along the trail and kept going, by families who crossed 2,000 miles in 4 months and arrived broken but alive, by emigrants who interacted peacefully with Native Americans in thousands of unrecorded encounters that didn't involve violence. Somewhere along the Oregon Trail, approximately every 1,000 feet, someone is buried. Most of them were children. Most of them died from diseases we can now prevent or cure with routine medicine. A few died from accidents. A tiny handful died from Indian attacks, in incidents rare enough that each one received specific historical designation and documentation. That's the real story of the wagon trains. Not circle the wagons and fight off the Indians, but walk another 15 miles today while hoping the water source ahead isn't contaminated, while praying the mountain pass is crossable, while calculating whether the food supplies will last to Oregon, while wondering if that cough one of the children has is just a cough or the first symptom of something that will kill them by tomorrow. The West was won by people willing to risk those odds. But the odds they faced had almost nothing to do with the dangers we imagine.